If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously curated, predictable, and quiet life, would be completely derailed by a man who smelled of sawdust and rain, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, papery sound I reserve for absurdities. My life was a series of straight lines. The walk to the station, the 7:42 a.m. train, the straight shelf books at the archive, the straight path home. There were no detours. There were no disruptions. And there was certainly no room for him. I didn't come to this city looking for love. I came looking for silence. The anonymous hum of a million lives moving in parallel, none of them required to ever intersect with my own. For 5 years, it had worked perfectly. My apartment was a fortress of solitude, my job a sanctuary of forgotten stories bound in leather and dust. My routine was a prayer I recited daily, a spell to keep the chaos of the world at bay. Then there was him. He was not a part of the routine. Not really. He was an anomaly, an unwelcome variable in a proven equation. I first saw him on the platform, a solid shape against the watery morning light. Big, broad-shouldered in a way that seemed to take up more than a share of space, dressed in work boots and worn denim that had seen better decades. He always looked tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion etched around his eyes. He never looked at me. He never looked at anyone. His focus was always inward, or on the scarred knuckles of his own hands, or on the approaching train as it screamed into the station. He was a fixed point in my morning orbit, a planet I observed from a safe distance, cataloging his details with the same precision I use for incunabula. The small, jagged scar above his right eyebrow. The way he'd run a hand through his dark, unruly hair, a gesture of pure frustration. The faded logo on his work jacket that I could never quite make out. In my head, he had a name. I called him Atlas, because he looked like he carried the weight of the whole damn world on those shoulders. He was a construction worker, I guessed, or a carpenter, something that required strength and left its mark on a man's hands. He was rough. He was loud, probably, though I'd never heard him speak. He was everything I was not, and he was, I was certain, painfully, hopelessly straight. It was a safe assumption. The kind of casual, unthinking confidence he projected was a language I'd learned to read from afar. It was the language of men who moved through the world without fear, who took up space without apology, who had never once had to look over their shoulder. It was a language I could never speak. So I watched, and I built a story around him, a narrative of a wife and kids and a mortgage, a life as straight and solid as the steel beams he probably hoisted for a living. It was easier that way. It kept him at a distance. It kept him safe. It kept me safe. The distance between us was more than the few feet of crowded platform. It was a chasm. I was a man made of quiet corners and whispered words. He was a man made of noise and force. We were two different species, occupying the same ecosystem by sheer coincidence. I was content with this arrangement, or so I told myself, every morning as my heart did a stupid little flip when he appeared at his usual spot. A frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs. Just a biological anomaly. Nothing more. My world was built on these denials. It was a fragile architecture, but it was mine. The day it all shattered began like any other. The same weak coffee, the same slightly too tight shoes, the same walk under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Rain was coming. You could smell it. A clean, sharp scent of ozone and wet pavement that cut through the city's usual exhaust fume perfume. I pulled my coat tighter and hurried my steps. I saw him on the platform, hood pulled up, head bowed against a wind that was beginning to show its teeth. He looked even more tired than usual, a grim set to his jaw. I took my place a dozen yards away, opened my book, and pretended to read. The words blurred. My focus was a traitor, drifting inexorably toward the solid shape of him. The train was late. 5 minutes, then 10. A collective sigh rippled through the commuters. Phones were checked. Impatient glances were cast down the empty tracks. The sky opened up then, not with a drizzle, but with a sudden, violent deluge. The rain came down in sheets, drumming a frantic rhythm on the platform's tin roof, a sound like 1,000 angry fingers. People huddled together, shrinking away from the spray. But not him. He remained at the edge, seemingly indifferent to the water soaking the cuffs of his jeans, his shoulders a bulwark against the storm. When the train finally arrived, a surge of damp bodies pushed forward. I was swept along with them, a piece of driftwood in a human tide. I found a seat, a small victory, and immediately retreated into my book. The train lurched forward, its wheels complaining against the wet tracks. The windows were instantly fogged, streaked with rain, turning the world outside into a blurry, abstract painting. We moved for maybe 15 minutes. The carriage was hot, steamy, smelling of wet wool and too many people. The lights flickered once, twice. Then, with a groan of tortured metal and a final, jarring shudder, the train stopped. Dead. A collective groan went through the car. The lights flickered again and died, plunging us into a thick, disorienting darkness. Only the faint, ghostly glow of phone screens provided any illumination. A disembodied voice crackled over the intercom, a garbled mess of static and apologies. Signal failure. Power outage. Indefinite delay. My stomach filled with bees. This was the ultimate disruption. The breaking of the spell. My routine was in ruins, and I was trapped in a metal tube with 100 strangers. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to find that quiet center within myself. It was then that a heavy weight settled into the empty seat beside me. A large presence, radiating a damp chill and the scent of rain-soaked concrete. I didn't need to open my eyes. I knew. The universe, in its infinite and cruel sense of humor, had decided to seat Atlas next to me. I kept my eyes shut. Don't look. Don't acknowledge. Be invisible. My mantra. My shield. But his proximity was a physical force. I could feel the heat of his body, the sheer mass of him. He shifted, his thigh brushing against mine. A jolt, electric and terrifying, shot through me. My entire body went rigid. It was nothing. An accident. The unavoidable consequence of a crowded, broken-down train. But my heart didn't care about logic. It was hammering against my ribs, a desperate prisoner. I could feel the dampness of his jeans seeping through my own trousers. It was the closest I had ever been to him, a distance of millimeters instead of miles. I risked a glance. In the dim, shifting light of someone's phone a few seats away, I could see his profile. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle leap under his skin. His hands were braced on his knees, his knuckles white. He wasn't looking around. He was staring straight ahead into the oppressive darkness. And his breathing was wrong. It was too fast, too shallow. He was not the immovable object I had imagined. He was not Atlas, holding up the sky. In the suffocating dark of that train car, he was just a man trying to breathe. And in that moment, for the first time, he seemed less like a monument and more like a person who was afraid. My own anxiety, a constant, humming companion, receded. It was replaced by something else. A strange, unfamiliar impulse. I watched him, really watched him, not as a character in my private narrative, but as the man sitting next to me. I saw the fine tremor in his hands. I saw the way his chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. He was vulnerable, and that fact dismantled every defense I had ever built against him. I could have said nothing. I could have retreated back into my silence, into the safety of my own head. It would have been the easy thing to do, the thing I'd always done. But his fear was a tangible thing in the space between us, a raw, exposed nerve. And I found myself wanting, needing to soothe it. My own voice sounded alien to me when it finally emerged, a quiet rasp in the close darkness. "Are you all right?" He flinched, a barely perceptible movement, as if startled by the sound. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time in a year of silent observation, his eyes met mine. They were darker than I'd imagined, and in the faint light, they looked wide with a kind of caged panic. He didn't answer right away. He just stared, and I felt pinned by his gaze, my skin prickling. My heart was a frantic drum solo. "What have you done?" "Abort. Retreat." Then he gave a short, sharp nod. His voice, when it came, was rougher than I'd imagined, a low, gravelly sound. "Yeah, fine, a lie. A blatant, Terrible lie. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. It was charged. We had crossed the line. We were no longer strangers in parallel. Our paths had intersected. My hand, of its own accord, reached into my bag. My fingers closed around the cool plastic of my water bottle. "Here," I said, holding it out. "Water." He looked at the bottle, then back at my face. His expression was unreadable. A mix of suspicion and something else. Confusion, maybe. For a second, I thought he would refuse. That he would erect a wall of masculine pride, so high I'd never be able to see over it. But then his hand, large and calloused, reached out. His fingers brushed against mine as he took the bottle. Another jolt. This one was different. It wasn't just a shock, it was a current. A spark jumping a gap. His skin was rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. The contact lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. I could feel the ghost of it on my skin long after he'd pulled away. He twisted the cap and drank, the sound of his swallowing loud in the near-silent car. He took 2 long, deep swallows before capping it and handing it back. Our fingers brushed again. This time, I was ready for it. Or I thought I was. The sensation was just as potent. "Thanks," he muttered, turning to face forward again. "It's just the dark," I offer, my voice still quiet. "And the enclosed space. It gets to people." I was talking about him, but I was also talking about myself. I was giving him an out, an excuse. He let out a breath, a long, shaky exhalation that seemed to carry some of his tension with it. "Yeah," he said, the single word heavy with admission. Something like that. The power dynamic had shifted. Here, in the dark, my quiet nature was a strength. My familiarity with anxiety was a form of expertise. He was the one who was lost, and I, improbably, was the one with a map. I wasn't just a nerdy guy with a book anymore. I was the person who had offered a kindness, who had seen his fear and not judged it. We sat in a new kind of silence. Not the silence of strangers, but the quiet of 2 people sharing a small, fragile space. An hour passed, then another. The air grew thick and stale. People's phone batteries began to die, plunging the car into an even deeper blackness, punctuated only by the occasional nervous cough or a baby's cry from further down the car. I found myself talking. I don't know why. Maybe to fill the silence, to keep the darkness at bay for both of us. I told him about my job at the city archive, about the strange things you find in old letters and forgotten manuscripts. I expected him to be bored, to grunt non-committally. But he listened. He actually listened. He would ask questions, his low voice a surprising counterpoint to my own. "So you just read old stuff all day?" Essentially, I admitted. "I preserve it. I try to keep stories from disappearing, he said. And then, after a moment, "That's cool. I just build things. And then sometimes other guys come and knock them down." There was a note of self-deprecation in his tone, a dry, tired humor that I hadn't expected. "Building things is important," I said, and I meant it. "It's tangible. You can see what you've accomplished at the end of the day." "I just have paper cuts and dust in my nose," he chuckled. A real sound, low and warm. It vibrated through the seat, through the point where our thighs were still pressed together. The sound did something strange to my insides, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. "My name's Leo," I said, the words feeling momentous. I had given him a piece of myself. "Julian," he replied. "Julian, not Atlas. A real name. A human name." It fit him somehow. It was solid, grounded. I rolled the name around in my mind. Julian. The hours bled into one another. We learned that an accident up the line had taken out the power for miles. We weren't going anywhere until morning. A collective groan of despair filled the carriage. But I felt a strange sense of calm. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only this metal tube, this darkness, and the man beside me. The train grew cold. The residual heat from 100 bodies began to dissipate, replaced by a damp chill that seeped in from the metal walls. I shivered, pulling my thin coat tighter. "You cold?" Julian's voice was close to my ear. "A little," I confessed. He shifted, turning more towards me. "Me too." He hesitated for a moment. I could feel the indecision radiating from him. Then, he spoke again, his voice lower, more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. This is going to sound weird, but we be warmer. You know, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was suggesting. Huddling together, sharing body heat. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, but it felt like so much more. It felt like a precipice. My throat was dry. Okay, I whispered. He moved slowly, deliberately. He draped his arm around my shoulders. It was heavy, solid. His work jacket was coarse against my cheek. He smelled of rain and something else, something uniquely him. A faint, clean scent of soap and sawdust and sweat. It was intoxicating. He gently pulled me closer until my head was resting on his shoulder and my side was pressed firmly against his. The heat from his body was immediate, a deep, radiating warmth that sank into my bones. It was more than just physical. It was a comfort so profound it almost made me want to weep. I had been so cold for so long, and I hadn't even realized it. My body was a live wire. Every point of contact was a supernova of sensation. The solid wall of his chest, the steady, slow rhythm of his heart beating against my ear, the strength in the arm wrapped around me. I was hyper-aware of my own breathing, trying to keep it even, try not to give away the storm that was raging inside me. He must have felt me trembling. His arm tightened slightly, a gesture of reassurance. Better, he murmured, his breath warm against my hair. Yes, I breathed. Much better. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking. The darkness was no longer threatening. It was a cocoon, a private world that held only the two of us. The rest of the train, the rest of the world, had faded away. There was only the sound of his breathing, the beat of his heart, and the incredible, impossible warmth of his body next to mine. It was in that cocoon that he began to talk. Not about work or the weather, but about him. He told me about his father, a man who believed emotions were a weakness and silence was a virtue. He told me about moving to the city, chasing a dream that had long since soured, leaving him with calloused hands and an empty apartment. He spoke of a profound loneliness, a feeling of being adrift that I knew all too well. His words were quiet, hesitant, like he was pulling them from a place deep inside that had been locked away for years. His confidence, the armor I had seen from afar, was just that, armor. Underneath was a man who felt as lost as I did. The chasm between us wasn't a chasm at all. It was a mirror. I don't know how to do this, he confessed into the darkness, his voice thick with a raw vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. This, connecting with people thing, I'm better with wood and nails. They do what you tell them, to my heart ached for him. For the boy who was taught to be silent. For the man who was taught to be strong, but never taught how to be soft. You're doing okay now? I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look down at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the dark shape of it, the faint glint of his eyes and the sliver of moonlight that now pierced the clouds. The air crackled with unspoken things. The space between our faces seemed to shrink, to become charged with a gravity all its own. I could feel his breath on my lips. My own breathing had stopped completely. This is it. This is the moment the world stops spinning. He leaned in slow, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. His lips, when they finally touched mine, were chapped and gentle. It was a tentative exploration, a soft pressure that sent a shock wave through my entire system. I responded instinctively, my own lips parting slightly, a silent answer to his silent question. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its gentleness. It was achingly slow, full of a desperate, tender honesty. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his callous thumb stroking my cheek. It was the most incredible thing I had ever felt. It was a story being told without words. A confession, an absolution. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine. I could feel the faint tremor in his hands again. Leo, he whispered, my name a prayer in the dark. I couldn't speak. I could only close my eyes and try to commit every single sensation to memory. The taste of him, the feel of his hand on my skin, the impossible, staggering fact that this was real. This was happening. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. He pulled me back against him, his arm a secure band around my shoulders. I curled into his warmth, my face buried in his jacket, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely, utterly safe. I drifted into a light, dreamless sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of Julian's heart. I woke to the merciless gray light of dawn filtering through the grimy train window. And I was alone. The seat beside me was empty. Cold. The warmth, the weight, the solid presence of Julian was gone. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I had dreamed it all. A desperate, lonely fantasy cooked up by my subconscious in a cold, dark train car. But the scent of him lingered on my coat. Rain and sawdust. And the faint indentation on the seat cushion next to me was undeniable. He had been here. The train lurched, a sudden, violent movement that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The lights flickered on, buzzing, painfully bright. People were stirring, groaning, stretching. The nightmare was over. We were moving. My eyes frantically scanned the car. I saw him. He was standing by the doors, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. He was staring out the window, a solitary figure once more. He looked just like he always did. Atlas. Unapproachable. Distant. My heart sank into my stomach, a cold, heavy stone. Did he regret it? The thought was a splash of ice water. Of course he did. He was vulnerable. I was there. It was a moment of weakness, an anomaly born of darkness and confinement. The harsh light of day had burned it all away. I was an idiot, a fool for thinking it could be anything more. The familiar spiral of self-recrimination began, sharp and vicious. The train pulled into the station with a final, screeching sigh of its brakes. The doors slid open. Julian was one of the first ones off, moving quickly, swallowed by the morning crowd before I could even stand up. He didn't look back. Not once. I sat there for a long moment, frozen in my seat, the noise of the disembarking passengers a dull roar in my ears. The space beside me felt vast and empty. The cold had returned, a deeper chill than before, because now I knew what the warmth felt like. The absence was a physical ache. I finally forced myself to move, my limbs feeling heavy, disconnected. I walked to the archive in a daze. The straight lines of my route felt mocking. The silence of the stacks, usually a comfort, felt oppressive. Every old book, every forgotten story, seemed to whisper about my own foolishness. The day was an exercise in torture. I replayed every moment from the train. Every word, every touch, the kiss. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted the desperation in his voice? Was I just a convenient port in a storm? The questions circled like vultures. My stomach was full of ground glass. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. The memory of his lips on mine was a brand, a constant, burning reminder of what I had briefly held and already lost. The next morning, I went to the station with a heart made of lead. A part of me hoped he wouldn't be there. A bigger, more pathetic part of me was desperate to see him. He wasn't there. His usual spot on the platform was empty, just a patch of stained concrete. The emptiness was a confirmation of my worst fears. He was avoiding me. He was ashamed, or disgusted, or maybe he just took a different train, a different route, to erase the memory of his momentary lapse in judgment. I got on the 742, the routine now a hollow mockery of what it once was. The seat we had shared was empty. I couldn't bring myself to sit there. I stood by the doors, the same spot where he had stood, and watched the city slide by, my reflection a pale, miserable ghost in the glass. The next day was the same. No Julian. The silence was deafening. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a prison cell. The absence of him was a presence in itself, a Julian-shaped hole in my world. I had survived 5 years in this city without him. Why did 2 days without him now feel like an eternity? I realized with a sickening lurch that I had done the one thing I had sworn never to do. I had let someone in. I had opened the door a crack, and he had pushed it wide open, letting the light in, and then had slammed it shut, leaving me in a darkness deeper than before. On the 3rd day, I almost didn't go. I thought about calling in sick. I thought about breaking the routine for good, finding a new way to work, a new train, a new life. But that felt like cowardice. It felt like letting the fear win. So I went. I walked the straight line. I stood on the platform, braced for another dose of emptiness. And he was there. He was standing in my spot. Not his. Mine. The place I always stood, tucked away near a pillar. He was just standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at his boots. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. My heart stopped. Then it started again, a wild, panicked stampede. Every nerve ending was on fire. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare at him. He must have sensed me, because he looked up. His eyes found mine across the platform, and the entire world just stopped. The noise of the station, the rumble of a passing train, the chatter of the crowd, it all faded into a dull hum. There was only his face. He looked wrecked and scared. He took a step towards me, then another. He closed the distance between us, moving with a purpose that made my legs feel weak. He stopped a few feet in front of me, close enough that I could see the dark stubble on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice low and ragged. I just nodded, incapable of speech. "I'm an idiot," he said, the words a raw confession. "I'm so sorry. I panicked. Relief washed over me, so potent and sudden it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't regret. It was fear. The same fear that had been my constant companion for years. "I panicked," he repeated, running a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture of frustration now looking like one of desperation. "I woke up, and the sun was out, and everyone was looking, and I don't know how to do this. In the dark, it was easy. It was just us. But in the light, I didn't know what to do. So I ran. If what I do, Julian," I finally managed to say, my own voice shaky. "The last 2 days have been hell," he continued, the words tumbling out of him now. "Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that train. With you. I didn't want to just be some weird thing that happened in the dark. But I was afraid you thought that, or that you regretted it, or that I was crazy. I didn't regret it," I said, the words clear and firm, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. "I thought you did." A flicker of something. Hope, maybe, passed over his face. "No," he said, shaking his head. "God, no. Leo, I haven't felt that. Connected to anyone. Ever." The 742 screamed into the station, its arrival a jarring intrusion on our private bubble. The doors slid open. People surged around us. Neither of us moved. We just stood there, on the platform, the world rushing past us. "I don't want to get on that train," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "Not without you. And not just to sit as strangers." My heart was beating a steady, strong rhythm now. The frantic bird was calm. "Okay," I said. "What do you want to do?" He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I want to get coffee. Right now. I want to skip work. I want to sit somewhere in the light and talk to you. And I want to get your number so I never have to spend 2 days wondering if I'll ever see you again." It was a symbolic gesture, but it was more than that. It was a promise. It was him taking a hammer to the wall between our two worlds. It was him choosing a detour, a disruption. A slow smile spread across my face. A real one. "My favorite coffee shop is 3 blocks from here," I said. "It's quiet, and they have good books." The relief that flooded his face was so profound it was like watching the sun rise. "Lead the way," he said, a genuine smile of his own finally breaking through the exhaustion. We turned and walked away from the train, away from the routine, away from the life of straight lines. And as we walked, his hand found mine, his calloused fingers lacing through my own. The contact was no longer a jolt. It was an anchor. It felt like coming home. The coffee shop was just as I described. Quiet, warm, smelling of roasted beans and old paper. We found a small table in the corner, a little pocket of privacy. We sat there for hours, talking. And it was easy, in the light of day, with the world moving on outside the window. It was just as easy as it had been in the dark. He told me more about his life, and I told him more about mine. We filled in the sketches we'd made of each other, adding color and detail and texture, until the strangers from the train platform were gone, replaced by 2 men who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. There was a shyness to him in the daylight, a vulnerability that was incredibly endearing. He wasn't Atlas. He was just Julian, a man who was strong and capable, but also gentle and scared, and trying his best to navigate a world that didn't always make sense. We didn't kiss in a coffee shop. We didn't need to. The intimacy was in the way he listened, the way his knee pressed against mine under the table, the way his eyes never left my face when I spoke. It was a different kind of closeness, a sturdier kind, built not in the desperation of darkness, but in the deliberate choice of daylight. That was the beginning of our new routine. Coffee in the morning, texts throughout the day, dinners at cheap diners where we'd talk until they kicked us out, walks through the city where he'd point out the buildings he'd helped build, his voice filled with a quiet pride. I showed him the archive, the silent, dusty world that was my sanctuary. He touched the old books with a reverence I hadn't expected, his large hands surprisingly careful. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, slowly became our space. His work boots appear by the door. His coffee mug, a heavy ceramic thing he'd bought, sat on my counter. The silence was filled with his low chuckle, with the sound of the television, with the easy back and forth of two people sharing a life. One morning, a few months later, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Julian was in my kitchen, wearing a pair of my sweatpants that were far too short on him, humming off-key to a song on the radio. The early morning sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. He turned, saw me standing there, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart swelling with a feeling so warm and full I thought it might burst. He handed me a mug of coffee. Our fingers brushed. The spark was still there, but it was different now. It was a familiar, comforting warmth, the gentle glow of an ember rather than the startling flash of a spark. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, simple kiss that tasted of coffee and toothpaste and a quiet, profound rightness. We took the train together now. We'd stand on the platform, side by side, his arms slung casually over my shoulders. He was no longer a distant planet in my orbit. He was my son. I didn't need to build stories about him anymore because we were building a real one, together, day by day. Sometimes on the train, I'd look at him while he was staring out the window, and I'd remember the man I used to watch from afar. The intimidating stranger, the man who carried the world on his shoulders. He was still strong, still solid. But I knew now that his strength wasn't in his silence or his solitude. It was in his willingness to be vulnerable, to admit fear, to reach out a hand in the dark. He was the disruption I never knew I needed. He was the beautiful, chaotic detour that had led me away from a life of straight lines and into a life of color and warmth and love. My carefully constructed world hadn't shattered. It had expanded, making room for a man who smelled of sawdust and rain. And my heart, once a frantic, trapped bird, was finally, peacefully flying free. That journey from strangers on a train to this, to sharing a life, often makes me wonder about the chances we don't take. How many times do we stand on a platform, just feet away from someone who could change everything and do nothing? It's a frightening thought. What do you think? Is it better to risk the disruption or to stick to the safety of our own quiet tracks? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more. Thank you for listening.